Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to SharePoint, Making the Business Case for a Misunderstood Platform, presented by IV4. Today we have Jean Morelli, Vice President of Operations and Senior Business Technology Consultant at IV4. And we have Bill Giroux, Business Technology Consultant at IV4. Both Jean and Bill are part of the business process team at IV4 and have extensive experience implementing SharePoint. And for those of you on the call who might not be familiar with IV4, we are a full-service IT provider with offices in Rochester and Syracuse, New York. We are a Microsoft Gold partner, a two-time Microsoft Partner of the Year winner, and a top 200 Microsoft Solutions provider. And just a quick few notes before we get started. We are recording today's presentation, and we'll be sending out the slide deck and the recording in a follow-up email. Also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat in the lower left-hand corner, and we'll do our best to get those answered. And that's it for me. Jean, take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you being here today. Thanks so much for taking a few minutes out of your day to be with us. So, we really think that this statement here on this screen is really appropriate for SharePoint and what its capabilities are and what to expect from it. So, no two companies are the same. Its culture, the operations, the processes, they're all very, very different. SharePoint isn't really a technology-driven platform. It's a business-driven platform, and that's what's so important to keep in the front of our minds when we're talking about SharePoint. I tell people when we're working together that really use your imagination. It's important that as folks are looking at SharePoint as a platform to build on, it's about your company, and it's about how you work and how you can work better. So we're really starting off today a series of webinars that each are only going to last about 30 minutes. We're not going to try to take too much of your time today. And it's really to talk about how you can use some of the Office 365 tools, and specifically SharePoint, how you can use those better. And today is really about what maybe SharePoint can do for you. We'll talk a little bit about SharePoint on-prem. We'll talk about SharePoint Office 365 and some other things as well. So to move on, let's talk about industry trends right now. What we have seen is that about 85% of all Fortune 500 companies have SharePoint as part of Office 365. Now, most of them, or a lot of them, also have SharePoint on-prem as well. Many of those are legacy systems that they are now migrating to Office 365 or doing some sort of a hybrid environment. In 2016, SharePoint saw a 67% increase in deployment overall. And that's SharePoint 2016 specifically, so that's on-prem. That was a 67% increase during that time frame. While SharePoint Online rose by about 167%. So you can see the growth in that cloud, just as we do with everything else in our industry right now. More and more people are moving to the Office 365 cloud platform because it removes a lot of the barriers. We'll talk about those later. And companies are continuing to find new uses for SharePoint all the time, really integrating it into their business processes. So in the last year, usage of SharePoint Online specifically has grown about 90%, while the content has grown 300%. We know that we are adding more and more data all the time, and we certainly see that throughout the Office 365 suite. And then more than 10 million new SharePoint sites have been created. That's huge. But I thought what was interesting here was Best Intranets of 2018, those awards were given back in March, and 6 out of 10 intranets that companies had created and submitted as part of this award, 6 out of those 10 were actually built on SharePoint, and that was both on-prem and in the cloud. So you can see that people are really adopting this and growing the use of that. It's when you're starting off with SharePoint, if you don't have it already, or even if you do, you have to ask yourself some questions. And you'll see this slide is fairly sparse. We don't have any pictures. It's just a gray background. But the purpose of that is really to say it's time to get rid of the noise, take kind of the fluff out, and really focus on what are the questions. Think about your business. Do you manage a lot of your business processes through Excel spreadsheets? And the answer to that for 99.9% of the organizations is yes. They have lots of Excel spreadsheets that they try to manage different parts of their business through. And while it seems fairly effective, it can probably be more efficient if there are workflows, if there are dashboards, those kinds of things. A lot of the new functionality in Office 365 surrounds the ability to share outside of our organizations securely. And so do you email internally and externally for collaboration? Is that one of the things that you do? We call it collaboration, but it's not really. Do you have any idea who has permissions to your data? Or do you have any idea about how old that data is that's sitting out on your file share? Can you report on any of that? Do you know what the most current version of your documents is? Maybe you have an old intranet that you built yourself or you had somebody build for you. It's kind of out of date. People don't use it. And maybe it's not being used to the extent it should. And so people have maybe some of those forms and documents saved locally. So we need to manage the use of that. Also, do you have the need to manage compliance requirements? And that's a big one nowadays, and everybody is very familiar with GDPR and the need to manage access to data and securely provide access to data. So compliance is huge today. Now, when we talk about applications in our organization, we often have to sell as business people, people managing departments, divisions. Sometimes we have to sell up within the organization. We need to determine what can I say to the CEO, to the CFO, to maybe the Chief Security Officer that will make them allow me to put this application in our infrastructure. And again, this is a platform. We're building off of this platform. So how do we get those funding? How do we get those resources allocated for a project like this? Now, sometimes it's pushed down, right, from the CEO who says, here, this is what we're going to do, and figure it out and just make it happen. But if you need to sell up, some of the key factors that the C-suite is considering now, and this came from a Korn Ferry study of about 199 tech chiefs, and some of the things that they're interested in today. So there is the need for a digital agenda. Thinking about the digital agenda, how is the organization using the web, using the internet, using presence to define their organization, to present themselves to their clients, to present themselves to their partners, and how are they using that? Also, they're looking at innovation. How do they innovate their companies? How do they progress them into the next century and decades? They're looking at data and analytics. They're looking at cybersecurity, and they're looking at workflow automation. Those are some of the top things that C-suite is looking at right now. So you need to sell to that. We want things to be more automated for greater efficiency. We need to be better ways to share internally with clients, and then we need to attract and retain talented employees. That's super important as we now have newer the next generation coming into our workforce, we have to think about what they're used to. They're very used to social. And so how do we bring that into a platform that they can use and they're very comfortable with using and sharing information? And then we also need to consider our data protection and compliance requirements. So we need to think about consistent branding and messaging across the organization. We work with companies all the time who look at SharePoint as a way to bring across their brand and consistently message that across the organization. We want to make sure that we're mobilizing our workforce. People are not sitting at their desks from 8 to 5 anymore. That's not the way business works. They need to be able to work from anywhere at any time, and that's what makes them feel comfortable. They need to be in a coffee shop, at home, traveling, wherever they happen to be, they need to be able to get to their data. And certainly for the C-suite, what's really important is providing metrics so they can manage the business and being able to do that in a way that makes sense to them, is quick for them, and isn't a dashboard as such. We have, over the past decade, seen our data sprawl, and our CEOs and directors of IT are really struggling with that, unfortunately. Their file servers are getting full, and they need to find a way to condense that. And a lot of times, a tool like SharePoint can help them do that. Being able to find data in the organization is critical, and having a less labor-intensive way to do that is important. And of course, securing our organization's data through data protection. We often talk about network security, but it's not all about network security. It's really about data security, and that's what's important. And so how do we do that a little bit better? So Bill, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about our first misconception.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. SharePoint is just for document storage. Well, it is one of the things that SharePoint can do, but we can do so much more with that. Let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. Automating your business process. I'm sure there are many questions that you get asked on a daily basis on how we can automate and streamline different things. But let's think about some of the questions we need to ask ourselves about what we're doing internally. If you use a paper process to move from one person to another, if you answer yes to any of these questions on the slide here, it's probably time to start really thinking about automating. You can use SharePoint, and there's other applications out there, but let's focus with the Office 365 suite. Is it difficult to develop reports? Are those reports manipulated in Excel? Do you need to have access to some live data? All of these can be pulled back into your SharePoint and given through different views. Next slide, please. One of the processes that we're going to talk about today is the onboarding process. And here's a brief Visio diagram looking at how to onboard an employee from hire all the way up through a review at the near the end of their life cycle. Well, not life cycle, but their employment. As you can see here, each of the areas is segregated. So management has one area to work in, but communicates very little with the IT department, which is communicating with HR, and every department is isolated. And they're all collecting separate data and moving separately from one another. When you implement a business process using SharePoint, as you can see on the next slide here, you'll see that everything gets streamlined down and you're getting rid of the extra communication. You're having more area for improvement on faster onboarding of an employee. You're getting rid of redundant information from like HR needs to know first name, last name, username, and things like that, but IT needs to have that information, and each area was asking for separate forms. So implementing the business process in SharePoint would streamline it, narrowing down the extra communication and narrowing down the amount of communication that is going out and being siloed to an individual versus a system that can track and view where you are in that process. Next slide, please. Here are a bunch of different processes. We're going to hang out here on this slide for a few minutes. But these are a few different things you can do with SharePoint. You can have your training materials up here for HR. You can manage your change request forms. You can have milestone achievements in different projects. I know all of you had gotten our case study on an employee directory, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about a particular client that we did for the onboarding process. They had 5 different departments tracking all of the same information. They had separate forms, and they had checklists to make sure certain parts of different forms were checked out. So what we did is we took all of those forms and implemented one SharePoint list. And as they were checking off the items, it was auto-populating for other departments. And when they auto-populated for that specific department, we would then send emails for the next department so they could automatically start filling out the information that was previously provided. In doing this automation, we were also able to supply different views for specific people so they knew where they were within a process. So they could track how far along this new hire was and what is still needed to be done before their start date coming on to the company. This onboarding process at the start was taking 2 to 3 weeks, and at the end of implementing this process in place, we were able to get it down to about 4 to 5 days to onboard an individual to go across this company and have all of the data supplied to these people that needed it in each of the departments. Next slide, please. So document management and search. How many of you today label your files? You got your file name, and then you have underscore V1 or you underscore V2. Then you move on and say, oh, this is underscore V2, but it's a final version, so now I need to have underscore final. You can see what I'm getting at, that the version control of a file is normally managed by the naming convention that people tend to use on a file server. Where do the people store their files? We try for them to get them to store it in the file servers, but most of the time people tend to store them on their desktop for quick and easy access because they need to get to it when they're traveling. How much time does IT spend managing permissions on these different file structures? And do you store these documents in file shares or don't know what the most current document is or where it is stored? So search is a big problem with files nowadays. Next slide, please. So with the document library, you have different areas that we can focus on, views and tracking versions, co-authoring, staying up to date, permissions, auditing, manage metadata. But what do all of these different things mean? If we're talking about views, you can have a bunch of information stored in a document management library, and you can create public or private views and make views available to only pertinent information that is up to you as to what you want to see or what you need to see, or what a group of people need to see on some live data that is going through your SharePoint environment. So if you have a C-suite person coming in and they need to know where something is in process, you would have a link to a specific view so they could quickly assess where things are, or color-coded different monetary funds that are going in the positive direction or negative direction, so they can correct the action needed for that particular process. Tracking versions, you can also view older versions of a file, or you can go one step further and actually restore that older version and make that the most current so you can stay up to date with version control. Co-authoring of files within SharePoint is done mainly online with SharePoint Online, where you can simultaneously edit different files. It's all great to be able to do that, but sometimes there's needs, compliance needs for files to be checked out. And to be able to make changes, you would want to put an approval process in place so you can, before files can be checked back in for others to be able to view these items. A lot of times people want to know when things are changing within their files. And with SharePoint, you can set up different alerts on the files themselves or the library themselves, and you can be notified very quickly as to when things are being changed. And those notifications can take place whether it's immediate change, or you can be notified once a day or get a summary of the changes at the end of the week, all depending on how you want to be notified. With permissions in the document library, they're very, very granular permissions. You can set the permissions at multiple levels. Starting at the file level, you can go to the folder, the library, the page specifically, or site and collection. If you don't have permissions to something in SharePoint, it does not show on the page that you are currently viewing, or it does not come up in a search function when you're searching for files. So permissions is a very high area of need for a lot of people, so they feel comfortable knowing that when a normal user comes in and searches for something, that they're not going to come up with something that they're not allowed to see from, say, the executive side of the world. With the audit tracking, we can define policies to help with the data loss prevention. So we can define these policies for tracking purposes. And with the managed metadata, you can attach file information that is company specific. This helps narrow down your search criteria. So if you're searching for something with this data attached to it, it will then help the search aggregate back and supply the correct information up to you. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Jean here for the next little section.
So we've talked a little bit about how SharePoint can help you automate your business processes. We've talked about how it can help you search and how it can help you with document management. When you all signed up for this webinar, you did answer a question as to whether or not you already had SharePoint. And I know that some of you did. I'm not sure if some of you have on-premise or if you already have SharePoint in Office 365. Either way, it's really important to consider which version is right for you, because based on what it is that you want to do with SharePoint and what your plans are going forward, it's important to get into the right one. So on this slide, we talk a little bit about online versus on-prem versus hybrid. So let's start with on-prem, because SharePoint has been around since, I think, 1999 in its infancy. And around 2001 or 2, it started to gain momentum, and in 2003, it really started to hit the mainstream. So it's old, if you will, certainly in IT terms, and it has gone through many iterations, and so there's a lot of older versions out there. But when we talk about on-premise, obviously that requires some infrastructure. That requires servers, it requires network infrastructure and security, all of those things wrapped around it. And it does require some in-house expertise. It requires physical space, fiscal resources, all of that kind of thing. But there are reasons to go on-prem. First of all, you may have some very strict compliance, regulatory governance policies within your organization that requires all of your data to remain on-prem within your control. That's one reason to have it on-premise. Now, with this, updates and upgrades are managed and installed by you. So some of us cringe when we say that because we don't want to have to do updates and we don't want to have to do upgrades because it's time consuming and tedious. But in fact, there are some specific reasons why you may want to have that under your purview because you may have done some pretty detailed integration maybe with some other on-premise applications. Or you may have done some pretty highly skilled development work within SharePoint on-premise. And if that's the case, then you may not want to do some updates and upgrades that are defined by Office 365 and are done by Office 365 on their schedule. You may want to do that on your own schedule. Of course, availability, scalability, disaster recovery is all fully controlled by on-site resources. And again, you'd have full access to do any customization. It is a SQL backend, so any reporting that you'd want to do, any customization of those databases, that can be done. And full integration with on-premise applications. I will say that there are lots of opportunities to do integration with Office 365 or SharePoint online as well, and there are more and more third-party products available for it as well. And of course, security and data storage are configured and controlled by you in an on-premise application. If we look at the online piece, when we go, just like any other cloud application that we look at, when we're looking at that cost benefit and the ROI, we have a very predictable per user, per license cost model with SharePoint Online. You know exactly how much it's going to cost for your users, and you will see as time goes on, Microsoft does more and more of that. So we look at it with Office 365. You can say every user that comes on board, it's going to cost me $22 to give them the full suite of Office 365, Office Pro, and some security features as well. So I know that's my cost. And now with Microsoft 365, they even build in the cost of the operating system and all of that. So, and even the management function like Intune. So now when somebody comes online, you know your monthly cost for that user. That's very helpful for operational costs of a business. You also do automatically get the very latest versions of the software. We've been used to in the past where we move from one version to the next, and every time we do that upgrade, we get new features and functionality. Well, quite honestly, now, every month in SharePoint Online, there's something new that comes out. And it's kind of neat to see all the new features as we move through that. And so by the end of the year, we have lots of new features that we can take advantage of. And then you choose which ones that you want to put in practice. Microsoft applies all those patches, and they, of course, have a very large enterprise data center that it's already secure. We don't have to worry about the security of that. We don't have to worry about the high availability. And so now that scalability, high availability, that's all taken care of by Microsoft. If you do on-premise, that's going to be a huge cost. It does fully integrate with a lot of the other suites, including Microsoft Office mobile apps and all of the other Office 365 tools, Skype, Flow, Teams, Power BI, Delve, all of those. And just to make a note, we'll be talking about those in one of our future webinars as well.
Hey, Jean.
And finally, yes.
You have a question in the chat. Do you know if Snap Surveys application integrates with SharePoint?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but we can certainly find out for you.
Thanks.
Sure. So the other one that I want to talk about a little bit is hybrid. And that the hybrid infrastructure is often used at a time when you have already you have an on-premise environment and you're looking to do some other functionality, which may often be some external sharing, perhaps with clients or business partners. And you want to be able to do that securely without having to build in the infrastructure of a DMZ and a bunch of different things. So you want to say, hey, I want to extend my SharePoint out, and by using a hybrid environment, using your on-prem with Office 365, you can now extend that out. And then, in addition, you may have pieces of SharePoint that work really well in an Office 365 cloud environment, and others, because of compliance reasons or integration or customization, may work very, very well on-prem. So you can do that. That can be configured. That shouldn't be a barrier to entry for you to go to the cloud. So let's talk about our misconception number 2. SharePoint Online is expensive and the allotted storage is not enough for all my data. We used to hear this all the time. So really, you may already be paying for SharePoint Online. Most organizations have already moved email into the cloud. They're already in Office 365, and they have some sort of a plan, whether it's a Business Essentials or Premium or one of the enterprise plans. And if you have any one of those plans, you already own SharePoint, in addition to a whole bunch of other tools. So you may just not be using it. And so it's a great opportunity to say, all right, let's think about what SharePoint can do for our organization, and let's start using it. Tell people all the time, try not to take a big chunk, take little chunks, prioritize what's important, and try to start off small with SharePoint and start to integrate it into your own business processes. The other thing that is brand new, so for those of you who are using SharePoint Online already, it's important for you to know that as of July 1st, you will now have, actually they're implementing this from July 1st through the end of August, but you will now see that you have 1 terabyte of storage plus 10 gigabytes per user that have a SharePoint license. So, and that is aggregate. So if you have one user using 1 gig and one user using 19 gig, you're still within your storage. So that's kind of nice to see that continue to expand. The other thing was that we had also heard one of the barriers was we have large files, and SharePoint limits the size of the file that we can store in there. And that has also increased. So now I think it's 10 or 15 meg that, or gig that you can store in there. So that should also not be a problem. So let's talk about misconception number 3, Bill.
Yes, you need to be a developer to make SharePoint look good. Ooh, that's a tough one. Let's move on. Today's modern intranet. Why you may need an intranet. Document management, lists and forums, collaboration with people, regulations, corporate identity, workflows, dashboards, and views. They all take a really active role when looking and creating your intranet. Next slide, please. Here is the out-of-the-box SharePoint. Whether you're online or on-premise, this is what you get when you're putting SharePoint web parts up on a page. You got your links on the left, you got navigation across the top, you get your calendar. It's there, it's functional. It just doesn't look as good as what it could be doing. Next slide, please. Now with SharePoint Online, they have implemented this new SharePoint Modern page. This is a great step up for SharePoint to be able to do this, but like I said, this is with SharePoint Online. This particular modern page functionality will be coming to SharePoint On-Prem with the SharePoint 2019 version. And if you want to get a little bit more fancy, you can implement third-party tools. And we, as a partner of LiveTiles, we can implement more fancier changes with your SharePoint web parts and pages and how it looks and feels. As you can see here, there's lists in the bottom left-hand corner, and you can add to those lists right away. You can search through those lists. So partnering up with a third-party tool like LiveTiles here gives you added functionality right on the main page of your intranet site, and it enables it to look and feel as a more cohesive unit. With this third-party tool, it's more like a drag and drop and implementing the information that's up here, so it makes it very easy to brand and customize your intranet. Next slide, please. Now, with all of those, as you can see, today's a mobile world, so all of those options come across with SharePoint Online on your mobile platform. Out of the box, your modern pages, live tiles, they all conform and shrink and come up with a nice cohesive look even when you go over to your mobile device.
So how can IV4, and I apologize, we're about 7 minutes over our half an hour, so I do want to start to wrap this up a bit, but we want to be able to talk a little bit about how IV4 can help. Our misconception number 4 is SharePoint is way too difficult and complex to implement. You know, it's really not when you know the steps that you need to take in order to start that process. We talked a little bit about this earlier. It's about requirements gathering. It's about prioritizing. It's thinking about the business. That's what's really important. IV4 can help with those new implementations, the installation and configuration, whether you're upgrading or you're migrating or you're starting off for the very first time. Or maybe you're just trying to implement some new functionality into something existing you already have. You have the business that you are meant to do. You have your core business that you need to tend to. It's our job to help you understand what new functionality is out there and help you implement. We can also help you build those workflows that Bill was talking about a little earlier ago, that we can help you with the business automation. And finally, consulting. Sometimes you certainly have the manpower within your organization that can implement some of these, but sometimes you need some facilitation with requirements gathering or building the architecture and design, thinking about the best practices for the implementation, and building governance plans around how you are going to implement and manage SharePoint. And those are all things that IV4 can help you with. And here you can see our methodology is really to engage with your business, to really understand your business and what you're trying to accomplish, and bring it all the way through the process until it has to be maintained. We want to make sure that you have a well-documented, easy to maintain system and bring you all the way through. And finally, I do want to mention that later in August, we are going to have a follow-up webinar to this, which is talking about accelerating Office 365 user adoption. And that is both for SharePoint as well as some of the other Office 365 tools, and how you can get your users to use it more efficiently and have some online help as well. We really appreciate everyone spending a half an hour with us today. We hope that it was helpful. Hopefully you got some information that you needed out of it. For any inquiries at all, please don't hesitate to email us. You can also get to us on the website. You can register for our other webinars. I know that Rebecca will also be following up with everyone. You'll get the slides. There will be a recording of the webinar as well, and certainly if there's any other follow-up questions. So thank you all very, very much, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We hope to see you again in August.